What were the factors which Semmelweis was considering during his investigation? Semmelweis were convinced that the diseases that killed the women after giving birth to the child was carried by the doctors and nurses, but the nurses and doctors didn't want to agree on that, or didn't want to tell people that they were the reason for the death. What links between factors and outcomes did Semmelweis observe? He tried having all his doctors wash their hands before going to the infirmary, it's called the clinic where they gave birth. He found out that the percentage of women dying was then lower. Then he decided that they should also wash their hands between the different patients and change gloves regularly, which made the percentage go from 12 to 1.3, the percentage of women dying from the disease, and it was over 2 years it went from 12 to 1.3. How did he explain his observations? A colleague of his died, and he tried to have to use that as an example because he died after he cut himself, and then he was in the room, so the disease was given to him by someone else, and he confirmed his idea because of the things he talked about in the earlier question. But then we come to the fact that doctors don't believe in what he says because or they do somehow believe in it, but don't want to say they do because they don't want to have people knowing that they were the reason for the death. And then he made the percentage go even lower, so he was down on 0.85 percentage of the women dying at his clinics. Suggest using your 21st century knowledge why washing in chlorinated lime was effective in controlling the spread of pleural fever. The chlorinated lime destroyed bacteria but also destroyed the skin. So the doctors, when they had to wash their hands between every patient, they started losing skin on the hands and get scars. Some of them didn't want to do that. That's why there was still a percentage of people dying who didn't want to wash their hands that often. And nowadays, in the 21st century, doctors use hand sanitizer, which still make sure that the patient don't get sick, but also it doesn't ruin the doctor's hands. Give 2 examples of antiseptic practices which people use at home to keep themselves healthy. Nowadays, everybody washes hands regularly because we have the possibility to do so. They didn't have before, and now we have the hand sanitizer, so they didn't have before, and that's why they use the kind of acid. And we also have better opportunities to showers and to wash our clothes and safety. Har vi ikke bestemt det? Så hvem er det var spørgsmål 6 fra?
So, yeah, question 6. Identify 2 reasons why doctors were unwilling to accept Semmelweis ideas. So, the first reason was that hand washing at that time was seen as a rather weird thing for the doctors. And the second was that the doctors, they refused to believe that they were the ones who were responsible for their patient's death um, instead of curing their disease. And question 7, which is about antibiotics. So why did the disease linger on in the UK, Europe, and the USA until the middle of the 20th century? So the hygiene and sanitation was still terrible, so people wouldn't believe that the diseases were transferable. And in the middle of the 20th century, around after Second World War, the antibiotics they became more available, um, which means that it was easier to cure bacterial causes, which cause diseases. And question 8 about this fever, also called childbed fever, suggests reasons why thousands of women in developing countries of the world still die each year from that puerperal fever and how they could prevent these. So in the countries like uh, Africa and so on, the knowledge of the microorganism was scanty. They didn't have a lot of knowledge about it, and the antibiotics were also rarely available. So the reason why some women still die after giving birth is because of the bacteria, and because, yeah, as before, not every country had the chance to get the antibiotics. Question 9. Which aspects of the cholera, I think, epidemic could be explained by the bad air theory? Um, they knew that the disease was transferable because large groups of poor people would be infected by this disease. And the doctors they thought that it was caused by touch or by air, um, also called like miasma. And today we know that this disease is contagious through polluted water because the bacteria they come through uh, excrements. Question 10, which is about a man, Edward Chadwick, and he argued that sewers should be regularly flushed with water to get rid of the smells. And in London, discharged the sewage into the Thames. So why did Chadwick think that this would improve public health? And he thinks that when the water is no, the sewage is flushed with fresh water, it will get rid of the bad air or smell. But he didn't take into account that the water would just flush the sewage to another place, the Thames, and B, in fact, it may increase the incidence of cholera. And how does John Snow's theory explain this? Um, it explains this because some parts of the city had the water sources from the Thames, which was now polluted by the sewage. So many people will get the disease.
Kan I læse mit spørgsmål først? Jeg kan ikke læse det igennem. Er du syg? What the fuck? Er du sjov? Nej, ja, Morten. Please gør det, husk jeg ikke ligesom Victor. Ligesom Victor. So I have question 11 to 15 of them.
It reads, Snow introduced the idea that the infectious agent might be able to multiply itself. Why was this idea important feature for his theory? Well, if the bacteria or infectious for fuck's sake, So I have question number 11 through 15. So question number 11 reads, Snow introduced the idea that the infectious agent might be able to multiply. Why was this idea an important feature for his theory? Well, if the infectious agent, or cholera, as he had a lot of ideas about, and if it was able to actually multiply itself, the disease would be able to spread itself. So, for example, if it got into the water or a pump or something, the disease would be able to spread quite easily, unlike with the other theory, the one with the gas clouds, where the poisonous gas clouds moved across the country. I mean, that theory, it wouldn't really be able to spread like quickly because, well, it's a gas cloud. It takes quite a long time for it to move. And also, the disease will also get worse the longer a patient is infected because it's multiplying, which would also explain why the patients tend to get more and more severe symptoms the longer they are actually infected. But that also kind of proves his theory. So, question number 12. In the 1830s, microscopes were powerful enough to see tiny organisms in water, but they were not good enough to detect the infectious agent that caused cholera. What influence do you think this had on the early rejections of Snow's theory? Well, since he wasn't able to prove any connection between these microorganisms and actually cholera, he hadn't actually proven anything. He just found out that there are small living beings inside our bodies, or yeah, just tiny living things. So really, he wasn't able to actually prove that cholera was because of the polluted water or because of these small organisms. So really, the officials had no reason to actually like close down the pumps because he hadn't proven that it was cholera. Identify two ways by which Snow demonstrates a link or correlations between the type of water supply and the incidence of cholera. Well, first he found out that people who got their water before it entered London were much more likely to not develop cholera compared to those who got their water after it had already passed through London. Because by passing it through London, there was a lot of waste, and well, people they used it as toilet waste and all kinds of things they threw in the river. So after it had passed through London, it would be filled with all kinds of bacteria. So that kind of also proves the point that it's passed in the water and not in the air, like a lot of other scientists believed at that time. Anyway. Secondly, he also found out that by removing a pump surrounding an area that had been quite affected by cholera, he was able to decrease the incidence of cholera by quite a substantial amount. Because okay, no, stop it! Fucking messed up yeah. So basically, by removing the Broad Street pump, he found that almost all of the incidents stopped immediately, which would also indicate that it was something in the water, not something in the air. Why was the removal of the handle of the Broad Street pump so effective at persuading some people that Snow's theory was valid? Well, basically, if removing a pump stopped all the incidents of cholera, it quite clearly can't be because of the air. Because, well, if the pump shouldn't have anything to do with the air, so that kind of validates that it is actually the pump and the water that is causing cholera. So in that way, it kind of debunks the theory that the Malay smell or whatever it's called, that is actually a real thing because well, why should removing a pump have anything to do with a giant cloud flying over the street? And question number 15. Why did Snow's study of water supplies in the South London support his theory, but not the melasma theory? Well, if people got cholera, depending on what water they drank, like if they drank from the Broad Street pump, they would be very likely to get cholera compared to if they drank from some water company that provided water before it entered London. Then that quite clearly shows that there is some correlation between the water and cholera incidents. So in that way, it supports his theory instead of the miasma theory. Because also think about it, if a lot of people in the same area were infected just at random, it might be actually like clouds of poisonous gas. But since people were there was a pattern, people were only infected if they actually drank the water from certain pumps. So they might live in the exact same place, but if they drank water from different pumps, then they would get different results. So he found that some people living in the same place, which would then have both of them to be poisoned if it was actually gas clouds. They were actually only poisoned if they drank water from a specific pump. So that again just proves his theory. And that was it for my questions. Okay, good.
Ja, det er min. Ja, del med dig. Det er sådan slides. Come on! Bare noget med røven, sådan helt fint. Vis at du kan synes ikke fuck med det der pisse. Nej. Det er fint nok. Det er ikke også, du skal sidde og se det her pisse igen. Det er Mette, der bruger hele sit weekend på at sidde og se de her lortevideoer. Det gør det, vi ved. Det er sgu da fordi Victor ikke kan finde ud af det. Jeg har det her. Are you ready? Okay. Okay. I have question 16 to 20. The first question is why did Koch's discovery of cholera bacterium help to convince people that Snow's theory was correct? Well, Snow mapped the deaths from cholera in like a small neighborhood, and he noticed that there was a clear pattern of where the inhabitants got their water and who were more likely to die. And Snow had further evidence for his theory that cholera was spread through water when he removed the pump handle from the water, as Morten explained just before, and the number of cases dropped with cholera. When Koch then discovered the cholera bacterium in food and water, it helped to confirm John Snow's theory that the bacterium was spread through water. By cross-referencing the two discoveries. The next question is, why did Pasteur realize that it would be difficult to prove
that spontaneous generation never happened. Um, the spontaneous theory was about life that arises from dead things, and it would be hard to prove. Um, can, um, ja, godt. Så begynder. Nej. Okay. Many intelligent scientists studied this theory, but no one was able to comprehend the microbe's behavior. The Italian biologist Lazzaro tried to convince people that microbes develop from other microbes and not by spontaneously uh, existing. Um, Pasteur began to research deeper into the subject and realized that it would be hard to prove that spontaneous generation didn't happen because he didn't directly have something to prove it doesn't happen. But he conducted an experiment in which he showcased there was no evidence that it happened. He did an experiment where he used swan neck bottles and visualized that microorganisms grew in both. Turning the bottles cloudy and moldy, which showed that that the microbes were already present in the bottle. The next question is, what is the significance of the observation that healthy silkworms became infected if they nested previously on leaves previously used by infected worms? Um, well, the significance, of course, is that the healthy worms got sick when they nested on leaves that were used by non-healthy worms, which shows that the disease is infectious by touch, and this then further proves that the disease is not like a miasma or a unbalance of the four humus or whatever, but that it's an actual thing that resides on the leaf and then transfers over to the healthy silkworms afterwards when they get in contact with the leaf, um, which I guess proves germ theory or something. The next question is suggest why finding a way to see and distinguish. Sorry. Suggest why finding a way to see and distinguish different kinds of bacteria helped convince people that the germ theory of disease was correct. Okay, so yeah, imagine that you knew nothing about a cow, like absolutely nothing, not what it ate, how it lived, or what it was. And then someone told you that like a 1-ton animal walked around the plains grazing on grass and only lived off grass. But you knew that animals can really break down grass because it's so fibrous, and that such a huge animal would live off nothing but grass, which has almost no nutritional value. That just seems absurd. So obviously you don't believe it because it sounds stupid. But then the next week, the person who told you about that animal came back with pictures and maybe videos of that animal, and a detailed autopsy of the animal and a live specimen. When you're confronted with all this information and all this these pictures and a presentation of the animal, it's hard to believe that it's fake because no one could possibly fake something in that high of detail. And the same goes for bacteria. It might seem stupid that something so small we can't even see it can kill so many of us. or that it spreads by touch or bad water or whatever. Um, but once you can see it and see how it lives and how it grows, and and that combines with the theories that are proposed for how it would work, then it almost seems too hard to fake, and it becomes extremely believable. And that's why often when we humans see something with our eyes, it becomes a lot more believable than something told by other people because it's so hard to fake. Yeah, yeah.
Alright. We have question 20 to 24. So the first question sounds, give two examples to explain why the body's defenses fail. And it's very different from person to person, but the age variation is a big factor. Because when you're very young, you haven't built an immune system yet, and you're very fragile. And the same goes with elderly people. It could also be open wounds, lots of bacterial growth in one place. Uh, yeah, that's probably one of the biggest factors. The next question, 21, is cholera still a big killer, and what are the causes? And it's not that big of a killer in all the developed countries because we have clean water, but in a lot of underdeveloped countries, like in Africa, they don't have access to clean water, and they might clean their clothes or uh, get rid of excrements and drink of all the same river, um, which can lead to lots of different bacteria and viruses uh, living in the water, and then by drinking it, you get infected. And again, it's the age and also financially that the countries or people in those countries can't afford to be vaccinated. So when a young child from say a country in Africa uh, gets born, already at the moment they're born, they're very vulnerable to diseases, which can easily be picked up because they have absolutely no immune system. Um, and by the time that they grow older, they don't have a very big chance of surviving that period because they're not vaccinated and they don't get the health care that they need. And the water sources that they have are very bad. Question 22. What fears are illustrated in the picture, and is the fear the same today? I don't know. Um, well, it's a large group of like common people, some posh people as well. But there's a lineup outside of the house, and they get inside and they get vaccinated, and then those who have been vaccinated starts growing cows out of their bodies, like it's some sort of side effect from this horrible disease. Because all these people who are lined up are not sick, and the vaccines were supposed to prevent sickness, not create sickness. But the first vaccines killed a few, and it just started a fear for getting vaccination. And this picture illustrates it pretty good. And then there's question 23, which is about Jenner's theory and how he tested the theory and what he predicted from it and how the experiments. So he wanted to test if a small dose of the disease could make you immune to that disease, because he had it was a well-known fact that if you had smallpox once and you survived, you were immune to it and you wouldn't get it again. So he wanted to test if you can use a small dose of a disease and then vaccinate people with that to prevent them from being lethally sick. So we heard about a milking girl who got she was she was always around the cows, but she had cowpox, but she never had smallpox, and then he thought that it might be if you get cowpox, you might also be immune to smallpox, and that was kind of the theory. And then he tested it on the girl's son, who got sick but survived, and then he didn't get any sickness from that. And then it's question 24. In the field of an experiment, chances favors only the prepared mind. What part of this is shown through his research with chicken cholera? And I believe this is Pasteur. Yeah, so what he means with this is that if you're not open-minded to new results or new theories, uh, the results that you get wouldn't really matter because you already ruled out most of it. So if you get a result that makes no sense, you might just scrap the research and start over. But the results usually tell you something that is worth investigating. And then when he did the same thing on chicken cholera, he actually got a vaccine to work, which was used from there on. Yes. So, TT.
Ja, ja,
Har ikke været 3 spil eller sådan noget. So, this mostly talk about him, Louis Pasteur, who was French, so it's kind of hard to pronounce his name in English. The first question, which is number 25, is where was the trial at Pueril such an effective demonstration of the germ theory of disease? Well, this trial, as we call it, was the demonstration of the well infected world
through the air or try to have the person touching it. It's not that these germs that actually come into your body that was the cause of diseases. It also began showing that the theory of these vaccines were real, that it was not a cheap, a weaker version of the disease that it would survive the stronger version of it. You get the weaker version would die, which is the whole basis of vaccines. Yes. Question number 26. Pasteur's version of an anthrax vaccine that was accepted rather than the one proposed by the young vet Toussaint. Why do you think this was the case? Well, Peter, you listen. Toussaint announced very early that he had a vaccine that could cure anthrax, and this made Pasteur very upset because he had been working on it for years at this point, and because of his reputation, he was more likely to get hurt from the outside world than Toussaint was. So he used his influences to basically tell everyone that Toussaint's version of this vaccine was as good as the one he was coming up with, which he didn't rush production of. And luckily it worked out, but it was more a case of him having this huge pride in his work and actually caring about the vaccine being made. Suggest possible errors which might arise from taking into account the reputation of scientists when deciding whether or not to accept their ideas. Well, it's obviously going to be more appealing to pick an answer coming from a veteran, coming from someone who's been through this before and has shown both during cholera and during this, or at least demonstrating the germ theory of disease. So Toussaint really didn't have as a liability. He couldn't say that he had years of experience or that he could prove his theory through identifies similarities and differences between Jenner's vaccine for smallpox and Pasteur's vaccines for anthrax and rabies. Well, they used kind of the same method of taking a weak disease. Basically, both used vaccines before they even knew what vaccines were. Differences come in the test subjects. They used the actual vaccines themselves. Jenner. Yeah. Henry Jenner used started testing out. Hvad er det, Tristan? Hvad er det? Okay. Farvel, Tristan. Farvel. Godt. Jenner has started experimenting already on humans like making progress towards vaccine. He just tried to cure a disease, whereas Pasteur's version or Pasteur's experiment more focused first on animals and diseases that way, and creating vaccines actually more than just curing. So and he only started testing on humans in the last part of the year. And the actual vaccines themselves differ from each other. Jenner used a form of cowpox to test smallpox, and Pasteur used a form of a weakened disease and then made subjects immune to the stronger version of the vaccine. For example, you could overwrite the disease by keeping it at 40-degree temperature at all times. And that differs very much from Jenner's strategy, where it was just like putting a disease into a disease. Question 28. What is your view of the argument that Pasteur should have spent more time developing the treatment before trying it on people? Pasteur's opponents argued that Pasteur was risking giving people rabies by his injections, and this was not justified because most people bitten by rabid dogs did not die. Well, you may argue that he took some big risks when. Okay. You may argue that he took some risks actually to include this vaccine as a mortality rate of only 16 to 100, which was what the mortality rate of a bite by a rabid dog was at the time. Most people think it's necessary to make a vaccine because so few people actually died of it at the time. It seems like a lot just today, but it wasn't back then. So it wasn't really seen as necessary, and then putting these people in danger wasn't really thought of as appealing just to make a vaccine. Maybe a couple hundred, maybe thousands of lives. That was really worth a lot when he was around. In question 29, at the time that Pasteur was studying rabies, there was no other research center in Europe that could repeat his work. Why did this make it harder for Pasteur to convince other scientists and doctors that his rabies vaccination was effective and safe? He basically did a lot of experiments, and because there weren't any other people who supported his theory, he was seen as the biggest expert there wasn't anyone else that could recreate his experiments, so everything he did was worked the first time. If it didn't work, then he was seen as